The military is weird about naming stuff. The video. Two things made me want to make this video. First is that people seem very weirdly up in arms about calling the new Army's vehicle a tank or not. Secondly, I was informed that not only do I not know how to pronounce the word chassis, but that I was lied to through the entirety of my 20s that the vehicle that I spent more time inside of than my actual house was not an IFV and was actually a tank. This is news to me. Now, there are plenty of forum posts you can read and videos to watch debating about what makes something a tank versus an IFV versus whatever this is. But I want to ask, why bother going through all the work of classifying all this stuff like you do? You can call an M1 Abrams a tuna sandwich if it makes you feel all warm and fuzzy inside, but it's still gonna shoot you in the face with a cannon. But it's not just tanks that have like this weird nuanced naming convention. This is a light machine gun, this is a heavy machine gun, but this isn't technically a medium machine gun? And you're gonna tell me that this isn't a rocket launcher, but it's technically a type of rifle? Okay then, that's fine I guess. But what's the point of all this etymological debate? And at the end of the day, does it really matter if the average person doesn't know the difference between these two things? Or are we all just playing gotcha in Reddit comment sections? Because I know I like doing that. To get to the bottom of this, I teamed up with the most famous tanker I know, Lieutenant Colonel Nicholas Moran, aka the Chieftain, who has forgotten more about armored vehicles alone than I've collectively learned about everything ever in my entire life. Back in the day, things were a lot more simple. You had guys on horses, you had guys not on horses, and you had guys who would start on horses but end not on horses. You had cannons, you had bayonet, and you had gun. You also had syphilis and typhoid, but it is what it is. So when did things, especially with vehicles, start getting all finicky?
Yes, the eternal debate. Is it a tank? The idea of categorizing armored vehicles dates back to their earliest invention. In World War I, there were differentiations between heavy and light tanks, and even self-propelled guns. As time progressed and technology and doctrine both evolved, by World War II, we see additional categorizations created. Now, sometimes they're of a format we recognize today, like tank destroyers, assault guns, self-propelled artillery, and sometimes there were categorizations by roles which no longer exist, like close support tanks, deep penetration tanks, and the like. Why is it important? Well, let me go back to World War II, when differences seemed to be kind of pedantic in the big scheme of things. And to a large extent, they actually were. In the US, distinctions were made between anti-tank guns and tank destroyers. Tank destroyers could be towed or self-propelled, yet those same self-propelled mounts were categorized as anti-tank guns in the UK. The difference was in how it was used, not what it looked like. Now, during the development process of the T-49 gun motor carriage, which would eventually morph into the M18 Hellcat, it was originally going to come out with bow and coaxial machine guns, like a tank, plus a roof over the turret, like a tank. In effect, it was a light tank with a big gun. It occasioned a letter from General Christmas of the Tank Destroyer Board, and he started by asking that the roof be removed, machine guns deleted, and armor lightened to better suit the tank destroyer role it was going to be designed for. But he continued, and I'm going to quote, and do a shameless plug for my book here as well. I understand that there has been some talk about changing the name of the 57mm gun motor carriage T-49 to a tank. I fully realize we have got to win a war, and in fact whether we call the thing a Tahuti or a tank or anything else won't win the war. There is a little point though of primary interest and morale. I feel that our tank program is coming along in fine shape. Certainly the M5 is a good tank. To date, except for the T-22E2, which has been somewhat modified to make a reconnaissance vehicle, we have no strictly newly developed tank destroyer weapons. I therefore would like to see the gun motor carriage name reserved for us, and that the Christie GMC development is primarily for tank destroyer purposes. Later, if this weapon proves to be a better tank than what we have, well and good. We cannot be dogs in the manger, and of course we will have to call it a tank and give it to the armored force. In the meantime though, I hope we can concentrate this mount for our own purposes.
Basically, as tactical shortcomings were identified, new technological solutions were introduced. There was an emphasis on speciality to a large degree, one piece of equipment designed to do one, maybe two things really well. We saw this mirrored in the small arms world as well, where infantry units were sporting 3, 4, maybe even 5 different kinds of ammunition just for the troops alone, when nowadays we generally max out at 2. This is basically how military equipment is generally created. A problem is identified, and then a role is created to handle that problem. Anti-tank guns weren't just invented on the off chance that someone decided to go off and invent the tank. Something is then built for that role using a combination of new and existing technologies, and there you have it, a new classification of stuff. But that's not always the best way to do things. Fielding an army with 50 different specialty vehicles is a lot harder than just 10 that can all have some pretty decent overlap capabilities. But it's this overlap, like this little part on the Venn diagram, that seem to have people just completely up in arms. But can we go too far with generalizing things? These days, the main battle tank classification of vehicle does basically 90% of what all the previous variations of tanks were designed to do, and it seems to be going pretty well. But what about this thing, the M10 Booker, which is so famously not being classified as a tank by the Army that it's all basically anyone can talk about with it?
Now, there's a couple of takeaways here. To include that this is not exactly a new discussion topic. As doctrine changes over time, so do definitions. What we might consider an assault gun's role today is that performed by a heavy tank in World War I. Further, because a vehicle can be used for any role the operator decides, regardless of whether or not the vehicle was designed to fill the role in the first place, things get even more questionable. For example, before the Striker mobile gun system came online, fire support in the units, and basically the assault gun role, was performed by the anti-tank missile variant. Not ideal, but it sort of worked. Similarly, US self-propelled tank destroyers, which looked a heck of a lot like tanks to the uninitiated due to their tracks, armored bodies, turrets, and big guns, were often used in the infantry support/tank role with reasonable success. So to the M10 Booker specifically, it's being categorized as a combat vehicle in the nomenclature, a pretty generic term. But it's not being classified as a tank. It performs what we would today call the role of an assault gun. It's worth noting that historically, the US's officially titled assault gun platoons were not filled by type-classified assault guns. They were officially either howitzer-mounted carriages or tanks of a specific variant. The M10 was designed specifically for the assault gun role, but may perform a tank's role to a reasonable level of capability. Indeed, it's not impossible some other nation may decide to buy M10 Bookers and place them into service as tanks, on the basis that 95% capability or whatever is good enough.
So if it's the case that another country can go off and call it a tank, why can't we? Sure, it looks like one. You got tracks, armor, spinny box thing on top, big gun. Where's the holdup? Why is this the one thing the DoD decided to gatekeep? See, the M10 Booker is being sent to light infantry units that haven't had a tank since the Sheridan went bye-bye. No one in those units have any experience integrating tanks into their formation, and if they've only spent time in a light infantry unit, there's even a chance they've never even seen a tank in real life. The 82nd Airborne receiving the first batch of the Booker is over 300 miles away from the nearest tanks. Literally, that's not an exaggeration. If you just drop a bunch of vehicles that look, sound, act, and smell like tanks, there's a good chance they'll be used for that. But if you go out of your way to explain, hey, don't use this like an Abrams or it will get exploded, people will probably listen a bit more, and calling it a mobile gun platform does a better job of fitting into the language they already speak on the light side of things. The military does tend to be super specific with its naming conventions, but I would argue there's a good reason for that. This is the Hemet, and yeah, I agree, talking about logistical trucks isn't the most exciting thing ever, but the United States has 12 different variants of these things, each with a slightly different job, but just different enough to where one can't really do the job of another. If you tell someone to bring up the Hemet from the rear, there is an equal chance they're rolling up with this, or this, if you don't specify. What about these two things? They both fire 84mm rounds, but this one is a rocket launcher, and this one is a recoilless rifle. Now, the differences between the two is largely in the differences in how the rounds they fire operate, but are used for pretty much the exact same role. So in this case, it is a matter of how it's built rather than how it's used, but if you were to pull an actually to someone firing it, they would probably just throat kick you and call you a nerd. If you look at things like machine gun classifications, it's kind of a mixed bag between ammo types and purpose on the battlefield. Light machine guns shoot the smallest rounds and physically weigh the least. Makes sense. Heavy machine guns are the heaviest and shoot the biggest round. Cool. But this is a general purpose machine gun and sits in between the two, so you would think it'd be called a medium machine gun, but it's not. It's called general purpose because it's general purpose. It's used for tons of different things on different platforms. Logical on one hand, confusing on the other, because a 240 Lima and a 240 Charlie are technically the exact same thing, but used in completely different ways by completely different people. Oh yeah, yank that shit. But I would argue there's more similarities between this and this versus this and this. Okay, but what about this? The Army's fancy new rifle. Is it an assault rifle? Those are generally considered to fire intermediate cartridges, but calling this an intermediate cartridge is starting to push it. Is it a battle rifle, as the kids say? I'm here to argue that it's actually just a reincarnation of the BAR, Prove me wrong. What the hell is this thing called? Plane? Helicopter? How about we pick a side there, bud? I don't like it. What about this thing? Or this thing? Or this? When will the madness stop? But who are these classifications for? Are socially ostracized teenagers battling out these definitions online so that a soldier somewhere has a greater understanding of why his truck is called what it is? Or is it all a bunch of hoo-ha semantics that boil down to the same kind of thing as saying, did you know peas are actually technically fruits? Or is there a legitimate reason we're deciding to split hairs here? Kind of both. Depends on who you are.
Is this all important? In the Army, sort of. Now, in theory, correct application of doctrinal concepts would keep the vehicle, no matter if it's called a Tahuti or a tank, used in the correct manner. Historically, however, we have seen that oftentimes, normally due to a lack of understanding, equipment is misused. And any additional psychological barriers against such misuse are likely a good thing.
What? Misuse? Military equipment? No, surely we are talking about different militaries here. I, for one, am appalled. Could you imagine if, hypothetically speaking, someone rerouted a few wires from an M2A3's whole battery, connected it to a 14AWG male adapter, and then ran the engine on said M2A3 for the sole purpose of charging your phone to look at Instagram? Of course you can't, because that would just be the worst. But are active duty troops just sitting around explaining the intricacies of doctrinal terms and categories? Shockingly, no, they're not. Weirdly enough, many of the conversations regarding classifications of things are occurring on the internet just between random people who happen to have an interest in this kind of thing. I said random people because if I used a more accurate term to describe those people, I would be alienating a very large portion of my core audience. Now, you will hear privates get yelled at for calling their rifle a gun instead of a weapon, but that's because hazing is fun and gun is usually reserved for light machine guns and up. So the question is, does it really matter if just a normal person calls something wrong? And I don't mean like keyboard warriors like me or people on War Thunder with questionable political ideologies. I mean just your average citizen who has no say in the matter and honestly probably could not care any less.
I'm reminded somewhat of that alignment chart, the tank alignment chart between doctrinal purists and technical. So anyway, if a typical civilian wants to call a Bradley a tank, I'm not going to lose too much sleep over it. Like the Ukrainians almost seem to be using the things as such anyway. If the civilians can recognize heavy mechanized formation, then it doesn't really matter which part of the heavy mechanized formation they're looking at, because heavy mech units do a specific job. As long as the guys inside the specific vehicles aren't trying to exceed the capabilities of those vehicles, who cares? Of course, also budgets are still a thing. And sometimes equipment needs to be placed in a service for a task for which it was not strictly designed. I'm at something of a loss to come up with the last vehicle the US Cavalry placed into service which was strictly designed for the cavalry role. Sheridan? Well, that had airborne infantry support as a requirement. M8 Greyhound? Well, that was originally designed as a tank destroyer. But they certainly performed the roles well enough, so much though I would like, for example, to see a purpose-built, unique to the cavalry vehicle for the US, I am not expecting to see one. Also, it's not beyond possibility for new concepts to be created in the future. Tank support vehicles like the BMP-T are a relatively recent idea, for example, albeit not one which has precipitated much development elsewhere. To summarize, what a vehicle is categorized as depends very much on what doctrine says it should do. I'm not a huge fan of defining a vehicle by its technical characteristics, and both doctrine and technology have changed over time, making consistent determinations of classification difficult. We would not consider a World War I tank to be a tank by today's standard, but a tank it certainly was in World War I. So if that clarified anything for you, good for you. I don't know if it helped or not really, but what the heck, it was fun speaking for 10 minutes.
So ultimately, doesn't matter what these things are called, kinda, maybe, but infinitely less than what people on the internet would lead you to believe. Well-trained personnel generally know the left and right limits of what's possible and what isn't possible with the gear, equipment, and platforms they're assigned to. Thanks for watching, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.